If we haven't been trained in our emotions, what makes it hard to isolate emotions is that frequently we feel many of them at the same time, and many of them in ways that feel conflicted. And this is why people are so confused about why their life is a certain way. Why can't I get up in the morning? Why can't I just apply for a promotion? Why can't I set limits with this person? And what's literally going on is you have a huge inferno of emotions that are restricting your behaviors that you're numb to. And so you don't realize what's going on, but what people feel is just paralyzed and stuck. So let's say that you were walking down the street as a grown adult, and if you try to pet a dog and it nips at you, in the first second or less than a second, you will have the identical physiologic response as a 5-year-old. Your sympathetic nervous system will activate, you'll panic, you'll get a burst of adrenaline. And then what would you say to yourself after the dog tries to bite you? Did I do something to cause this? What's going on with the dog? Maybe I should be a little bit more careful. So what you literally do is you take that emotion and then you look at it from different perspectives. This is also what we do in psychotherapy. When someone has let's say they have a bunch of shame, we'll ask the question, okay, where does that shame come from? How do you feel about that? What are the different ways that you can look at it? And if you sort of look at it, the other thing that happens with shame is we start to develop identities of ourselves. So there's the emotion of shame, and then we start to form conclusions about ourselves. Like, I feel ashamed in this moment, and then that becomes, I am a terrible human being. I'm a loser, right? Now this becomes a statement of fact that has a life that is independent of the shameful experience. So when we talk about processing shame, there is some amount of emotional work, but then there's also work on the ego level, or the ahamkara is what it's called in Sanskrit, where our emotional experiences result in conclusions that we form about ourselves. And so those conclusions need to be re-examined. And the most damning thing is that when we are emotional, we form very powerful conclusions, but since we are emotional, they are more likely to be wrong. Because you go through all these conclusions in your head. This person is terrible, women are terrible, I'm terrible, I'll never find love again. You form all these conclusions from an emotional state. But those conclusions don't go away when literally the emotional circuitry of our brain reaches homeostasis or equilibrium. Those learnings stay with us. So how do we process shame, or how do we handle shame? Let's divide it into a couple things. One is that there are certain techniques that you can do to literally reduce the activity of your negative emotional circuitry. So you can do things like breathing exercises. We know that each emotion is correlated with a certain pattern of breathing. So our emotional energy, when we have our amygdala and our limbic system that's active, there are certain physiologic changes. And we can engage in certain techniques to essentially reduce those. And this is why breathing is really helpful, because if you change the nature of your breath, everything in the body has a homeostatic, so there's a feedback loop. So you can start breathing a particular way, and as you breathe a particular way, it will alter your emotions. If you feel a certain emotion, it will alter your breathing. So we can work on that level. Then the second thing that I kind of mentioned is that we have, once we have emotions, then we have kind of like these conclusions that we draw. We have impacts on our identity, which is our ahamkara or our ego. And then once we have those kinds of conclusions about the world and about ourselves, those then form the basis of our logic, which then influence our behaviors. So we want to reduce the emotion in the moment, and then we want to critically look at the conclusions that we've drawn about the world. And then the last thing that we really want to do is pay attention to how do these conclusions become automatic behaviors. And then if we want to change those behaviors, then we need to look at our sense of our identity as well as our emotional experience. So in the East, what we would say is there's this ball of undigested emotional energy. This is what I would call a trauma that lives in your subconscious. And then in the West, so that's what we'd call like a trauma, and that lives in your subconscious in some way. And then this generates something called a schema, which is like a way of thinking. So we can have these sort of automatic thoughts from cognitive behavioral therapy, or narcissistic defense mechanisms when we're talking about ego or ahamkara. And then we also know from CBT that both of these things will influence behavior. So I'll give you just a simple example. So let's say I go eat at a restaurant 5 times, right? And it's my favorite restaurant. The 6th time I go, I get food poisoning. So if we look at like what happens, if you get food poisoning once, your brain does not calculate, okay, 15% of the time we get food poisoning, so we should be able to eat there. All it takes is one negative experience to bias all of our recollections of the past. And that's a survival mechanism. So let's think about like when we were evolving, let's say I go to a watering hole to get water, but the 6th time I go, a crocodile jumps out at me. It is of a lot of benefit for my survival if I go back and question the last 5. Did I get lucky? Was that actually safe? Who knows? So one of the things that we know, and there's a fascinating field of science which is emerging now called neuroeconomics. And neuroeconomics is fascinating because it looks at all of these cognitive biases that we have, especially around negative experiences. And one of the things that we learned is that the human brain doesn't want to perceive reality. It wants to adjust reality for the benefit of survival. And I'll give you just a really interesting and terrifying example of that. So our brain, when we look at, let's say I'm going to ask a girl out on a date, okay? So our brain, when I think about asking the girl out on the date, the dopaminergic centers of my brain, the nucleus accumbens, the place that I feel pleasure. So if I ask her out and she says yes, I feel an exhilaration of pleasure. The dopaminergic circuits of my brain in a hypothetical yes do not activate. But the negative emotional circuitry in my brain can activate and actually make me suffer based on a hypothetical. If you've ever been in this situation and you think about how things go wrong, that's not a hypothetical. You can feel the pain of a future loss today, but you cannot feel the pleasure of winning an award or getting a trophy today. Like literally, hypotheticals can activate your negative emotional circuitry in the present, but they do not activate your dopaminergic circuitry. And this is what makes it so hard, is that if we haven't been trained in our emotions, what makes it hard to isolate emotions is that frequently we feel many of them at the same time, and many of them in ways that feel conflicted, right? So when I get dumped, what do I feel? I feel love, I feel grief, I feel sadness, I feel hopeless, I feel relieved. At least it's over now, but we're not aware because it's so complex. The problem is that being numb to something does not mean that it doesn't exist. And this is why people are so confused about why their life is a certain way. Why can't I get up in the morning? Why can't I just apply for a promotion? Why can't I set limits with this person? And what's literally going on is you have a huge inferno of emotions that are restricting your behaviors that you're numb to. And so you don't realize what's going on, but what people feel is just paralyzed and stuck. And they don't realize why they can't be like these other people that are disciplined and hardworking. Like, why am I not like this? Why can't I just get out of bed and do what I need to do? Well, there's something else that is motivating you to not do that. And that's usually an emotion that you're blind to.